Hello, this is the 9th lecture, narrated one this time, in the Understanding Crime module, and this particular lecture is looking at symbolic interactionism. And as well as Mead's ideas on symbolic interactionism, we've also got a bit of assignment support for the teaching materials task, and another case study to look at, a fifth one, this time Edmund Kemper, whom we have mentioned a couple of times in this module, and I think we also mentioned him for those of you who did the criminal psychology module as well. He was also one of the villainous characters we touched upon there. So if we start out with the assignment support, now the deadline for that is the 1st of May, and that's remaining at the 1st of May at the moment. There's no proposal to put that back at all. And I'll give you the short recap on this that we've gone through in class previously, and if you do have any ongoing queries, it's probably easiest if we address them maybe using the chat function on Brightspace, so that I can answer questions that several of you might have simultaneously rather than repeating the same thing in half a dozen different emails. So you create your PowerPoint. I'm suggesting 5 slides. That's just a guideline. It doesn't, if you've got 4 slides or 6 slides or 7 slides, what have you, that's not an issue in and of itself. And obviously the first slide is likely to be just an introductory screen, a bit like the one on this PowerPoint, to tell your imaginary students what the topic of this short little lesson is going to be about. And then you have your set of slides, and I do advise you to keep it fairly short so there's not too much writing on each slide. Chuck in a few pictures. Technically, you, because this is a coursework rather than a real lecture, technically you probably ought to include the source link for any photographs you use. It's not a major issue if you don't, but technically you should. So I suggest if you bung in a screen at the very end and just cut and paste the links that are relevant to any photographs or images of whatever type that you have pasted into your PowerPoint, and that will meet that particular tick that particular box, as it were. So you're going to choose a sociological theory of crime, go for one of the simpler ones, and look at how it's changed over the decades. So maybe have a theory that perhaps dates back, let's say, to the 30s or 40s or 50s, and then bring in some up-to-date information that either supports that theory as still being relevant or contradicts it as no longer being relevant and suggests that the theory needs to change in some way. So you're just charting a theory over a passage of time, kind of early version, current version, and keep it simple, because just imagine you're talking to this class of imaginary teenagers who maybe don't have the highest attention span in the world, so you need to keep it short and sweet and to the point. Then create in Word a handout explaining any terms, jargon terms, specialist words that you've included in the PowerPoint slide, so just a sentence or two explanation for each of the terms that you've used. It's for the benefit of these imaginary students, but also to show how you would try to explain things to them in ways that they would understand. Then another sheet, and you can stuff all these handouts into one document and upload just the one document, than uploading lots and lots of separate documents. So your PowerPoint would be one thing, and your handouts could all be placed within one single larger Word document. That makes life easy. So create a little kind of mini quiz type thing that you would set them, suggesting 4 questions, 3 of them multiple choice, A, B, C, D, or D type answers, and one of them an open-ended question where they would have to write a sentence or 2 or 3 to answer a question. And it's all got to be connected to what was in your PowerPoint slide. So imagine you've shown them the slides and turned the PowerPoint off, and then you're asking them this quiz, or setting them this quiz to test that they're actually awake and paying attention to the PowerPoint itself. So it's all interrelated to these slides you've just shown them. And then finally a worksheet that they have to fill in as an activity, That worksheet could be, well, it could be all sorts of things actually. It could be something like a word search, or it could be one of those things where you've got a paragraph with missing words and they have to decide what the missing words are in the paragraph. And again, that paragraph should obviously be related to the ideas you've looked at in your mini teaching session. Or you could do anagrams, any kind of little gamey type thing really that the group of teenagers could be engaged in, which is A, occupying their time, B, giving them something to do that's not listening to the teacher, and C, helping them to remember certain keywords, phrases, ideas by rehearsing them, going over them, helping those notions to stick in their head. And then you create, and this again can be in the same document, a 1,000-word reflective piece where you're effectively justifying the choices you've made in those handouts and so forth that you've included. Why have you put the things there that you've put there? So going back to this, for example, why is it important that they know those particular terms? What are those 4 questions helping them to think about and reflect on? If you've done a word search or a missing words thing, whatever it is, are there particular ideas, themes that you are including in that little game worksheet that it's important for your students to remember and know about? Also, you can mention things you've included in the PowerPoint. Why are you taking that angle or that approach, or maybe getting them to discuss some, like a mini discussion about some contemporary issue that's related to the theory you're looking at as part and parcel of your PowerPoint. And finally, include a brief mention. This only really needs to be a paragraph or so. What you would do to help these 2 students with specific needs. So Bob, with his dyslexia, your answer there could be something along the lines of ensuring that the various handouts and quiz sheets and what's-its are on green paper, blue paper, pink paper, whatever is relevant to the particular type of dyslexia he has. Or maybe it could also be ensuring that a learning support assistant is hovering around with Bob to help him if he gets confused over anything. And likewise for Zafia, good spoken English, but not quite as good written English. So what could you do to help her? Well, possibly you could include one of the quiz sheets or something like that translated into Polish. If you can find anyone to translate it, and you don't actually have to do that as part of this task, just mention that you could do that to help Zafia. Or, given that she doesn't know a great deal about British social systems at the moment, if you are including discussion of some crime that had taken place in Britain as part of your PowerPoint, you could also chuck in a similar sort of crime that took place in Poland, so that Zafia would kind of think, oh right, that's what the teacher was talking about, and have a better understanding. So things like that you could mention. But that's really, the 1,000-word piece is just a short reflective approach. Ideally, if you write it in the sense of the teacher could do this, the teacher could do that, this would be a useful technique to use. You can bring in a little bit of teaching theory to say ideas that repetition of motion assists students in learning. Again, justify with teaching theories that why would you have a discussion of a real-life crime, because often students find it much easier to grasp issues when it's related to real situations that they're familiar with from the news, rather than it all being airy-fairy and abstract. So you can bring in a little bit of a justification from theory, as well as your own decisions that this has been created because it's important for the students to remember these words, those words, and so forth. That's essentially it. If you have further questions, I say, let me know, and we can either set up a group chat on Brightspace or something similar using a different style of social media. So people with several questions, or perhaps several quite similar questions to each other, can get their answers all at the same time. Right, and likewise I suggest if you want to bounce ideas around each other, I know some of you are on Facebook with each other, and some of you use WhatsApp and various other methods to keep in touch. So as well as talking to me about things, you can talk about them to each other, bounce them round, share ideas, share concepts. What about doing it this way? What about doing it that way? Etc. Particularly useful, perhaps, for any of you who have never stood in front of a class and tried to teach that class anything. Although, in a sense, you've all done presentations to the rest of the class, so you've all had some experience of standing in front of a class and teaching. So even if you've never taught spotty teenagers, nonetheless, you will have some experience of being up front and how you get the other members of class to grasp the ideas you're putting across. And then from there we move into the actual substance of this lecture. This is George Mead with his very impressive moustache. Man of many, many, many ideas, not most of which we won't be able to cover in this, partly because they're not all relevant to crime, partly because there's just too many ideas to squeeze into one lecture. Developed a pragmatist philosophy, we'll weave in elements of that as we go along. Talked about the means of living, how people not only make a living in terms of making money, but how that becomes a means of establishing their identity, their sense of self, their sense of purpose. How they kind of not just make money, but make meaning, make a sense of being in the world by whether it's anything from hunting, shooting and gathering berries in some ancient tribe, all the way through to a job in a bank or a shop or whatever it might be in this day and age. It's all means of engaging with life and with living, and the methods by which we live, and how part of our living experience is also the finding and formation of symbols that helps us to be ourselves, to exist in the world, to engage with other people. Most things we do have if not indeed everything that we do, has a symbolic element to it, and that's something that particularly fascinated me. He also developed ideas around identity development, how we grasp our sense of who we are, where we fit in the world, how we participate in wider society. And labelling theory, which does certainly have a relevance to crime. Becker more developed that with respect to crime, but it has its roots in George Mead's theories. So getting on to the pragmatist philosophy, a number of points to flag up here. As I dare say you would have gathered by now, philosophy and religion and so on are my kind of pet hobby horses, and I'll drone on about them for hours and hours and hours at an end. But be relieved that I'm not going to do so. I'll try and keep this short and sweet and practical. So a key point of pragmatist philosophy is that reality fundamentally exists in our minds, in our mental representations, more so than it does out there. Now, obviously, if I fall off my chair and land on the floor, it will hurt because the floor is actually out there, and it's not in other words, it's not my mental representation of the floor that will bruise my head. It's the reality of the floor that will bruise my head. However, our notions of what a floor is, what a floor should or should not be made out of, if you're constructing a building, you put a floor. If you're in a mud hut, do you put a floor in? Or do you just simply stamp down the earth that's already there? At what point in architectural history did people decide they no longer wanted mud floors, and instead they wanted to put down cobblestones or flagstones or wooden boards, or cover the mud in straw or what have you, to create notions of a floor? So whilst there is no denying that the floor is a physical object that does actually exist and will actually hurt me regardless of what I do or don't believe, conceptualizing a floor and therefore creating, shaping, structuring a floor as a builder making a house or some other kind of structure, that involves cognitive processes and ideas and mental representations. And those mental representations don't just pop into existence out of thin air. They are the product of a lifetime's worth of social interaction with other people. What we are told, what we hear on TV or radio, what we read in books and magazines and on the internet, how we're socialized 1,001 different influences will help shape our mental representations as to what the nature of reality is. And certainly once we move away from physical structures like doors and chairs and tables and floors, and we think in terms of more abstract notions like gender, sexuality, law, justice, crime, they are clearly quite abstract notions that are heavily influenced by what goes on in our minds and exist really more in our minds than they do necessarily in objective reality, although they may interact with objective reality, as in gender interacts with notions of your actual genitalia, but it also goes beyond that to other much more abstract things as well, such as ideas on clothing and cosmetics and hairstyles, things that are very much cultural notions rather than concrete physical objective realities. Part of being pragmatic is to work with what is useful. And that's true of any of the use of the word pragmatic in general. So when we talk about pragmatic philosophy, it's trying to apply philosophy in a useful, sensible, everyday sort of a way, a pragmatic, practical sort of a way, rather than in a very abstract, airy-fairy, grow a beard, dance your kneecaps type of a way. So looking at notions and ideas of what works. Now, not only do people with very long beards puffing on pipes in armchairs writing books about philosophy deal with the world of abstract philosophy, we all deal with abstract philosophy. Our very existence and how we engage in the world reflects our philosophies about the nature of the world. And what we think about the nature of the world, for the most part, putting aside those people in armchairs puffing on pipes, for the vast majority of us is of a very pragmatic nature. It's ideas that we have tried out in the past and which seem to work. If you persist in trying out an idea that hasn't worked the first 10 times, but you do it for an 11th time, then it suggests that maybe you have issues, to put it politely, in that most people, if it didn't work the first 10 times, would probably have given up after the first 5 failures, let alone be ploughing away for 10 failures. We try ideas, if they don't work, we ditch them and move on to something that does appear to work. We are, for the most part, quite practical, pragmatic creatures. So we start to define objects in the world and general ideas like justice and truth and kindness, big grand ideas like that. And we define other people as well, other human beings, and we start thinking about ourselves, going back to his ideas and identity, in terms of practicality, of what works and what function people perform. So this isn't quite functionalism full on in the sociological sense of functionalism as a grand idea, but it is starting to overlap with it a bit in that we tend to think of people mostly in terms of how we interact with them, rather than necessarily thinking in terms of how other people interact with them. So to give you a very silly example, I once bumped into my bank manager at the train station, and it took me about 5 minutes to work out who the hell she was, because I was only familiar with having ever met her in the bank, and so my notion of her as a person not only was her face, but also the fact that she was sat behind a desk in a bank dressed in a sort of bank manager's style outfit. I wasn't used to seeing her in casual attire at a train station, so it took a while to place who she was. Because my understanding of her was in terms of how she, or how I had related to her in one very specific context. What she's like at home, with her family, with her friends, I've got absolutely no idea, and frankly no real interest, because I only relate to her in one situation the vast majority of the time, except for randomly bumping into her at train stations. Likewise, you might have an idea of what your lecturers are like, me included, but that is based upon how they behave in lectures, or when you're having one-to-one tutorials with them. What they're like when they go home, of an evening or of a weekend, or at the moment all the flaming time, is another question again. You probably may not have ever met them You might have bumped into one of your lecturers in a supermarket or something, but chances are you probably haven't. Therefore, you don't necessarily have a clear understanding of what they are like in any other social context. You understand them as teachers, as lecturers, not as husbands, wives, brothers, mothers, sisters, fathers, friends, or any of those sorts of social contexts. And so we get used to people as well as objects like tables and chairs and laptops according to the context we use them in, the practical usage they have for us. And that does overlap into crime, and we'll get onto ideas of how that overlaps into crime. But primarily it's in terms of how criminals understand other people, and how we can understand criminals for that matter. But a criminal comes to understand other people by their usage. So a con man or con woman might understand people primarily in terms of how gullible they are. So in other words, who would make a good, easy target, and who would be a difficult, awkward target. So is this person easily connable, or are they a pain in the neck and best avoided? A sexual predator might start classifying and understanding people in terms of whether they are potential victims, potential witnesses. If they're potential victims, are they the kind of victim who could be easily silenced? Or would they be the kind of victim that would be sort of scream out, cry for help, run away, punch them in the face, do what have you, and therefore be difficult to overwhelm in the course of committing their crime? And therefore maybe they would avoid people they classify in that bracket. Other people they might classify as police officers or what have you, or at least on the side of law and order, therefore the kinds of people who might, if they heard a scream, pick up a phone and call the police rather than just ignore it. So we start to, again, you can think of people in a crime-related light as well as in a, say, education-related light or a bank manager-related light or any other kind of a light. So again, thinking about other ways in which we can start applying notions of pragmatic philosophy. First off, this idea that things are very internal structures within our minds, our belief systems, more than they are objective physical realities. Crime as an idea, as a concept, like law and order and justice and so forth, it exists more in the mind than it does in the objective reality. A behaviour is a behaviour. It may or may not be considered a crime by a given society. So an activity that's legal in one society is criminal in another. What has changed is not the behaviour necessarily, but the perception, the understanding in the minds of observers, witnesses, police officers, courts, and of course in the mind of the person conducting and engaging in the activity. So how they understand themselves may have changed according to where they are in the world or what period of history they are in the world, depending on whether the behaviour they're doing is legal or illegal in that time and in that place. Does that radically change your self-understanding, your point of view? So take a fairly obvious example. If you've got someone who is gay and they live in Saudi Arabia, and another person who's also gay who lives in Suffolk, is the Suffolk person's understanding of themselves different from the Saudi Arabian person's understanding of themselves? Because the Suffolk person understands themselves as non-criminal, or at least criminality does not enter into their understanding, let's put it like that. Whereas the Saudi Arabian person, criminality does enter into their understanding of themselves. Whether they agree with the law or they're dead against the law is another question, but even if they're dead against the law, they will be very conscious that they are living in a society where they could very easily end up in court, end up in prison, end up suffering all sorts of horrible punishments, and so that will shape what they do, what they don't do, what they avoid doing, where they do things, where they don't do things, what they say, who they say it to. A whole raft of issues kind of kicks in according to such a thing, and such a self-understanding and a social understanding. The behaviour is, at one level, much of a muchness, whether it's in Arabia or Suffolk. But the understanding, the mental construction of it, which is the sort of symbolic element of Mead's theory, that changes according to the society in which you live and how it shapes your mind and your understanding of yourself, of other people, and so forth. Given that this philosophy is pragmatic, we might then start to think about how useful various theories are of crime. Not so much a question of right or wrong, but a question of how useful. So a theory that describes crime very accurately might not necessarily always be terribly useful. The question becomes then, useful to who? Well, useful to police, useful to the courts, useful to probation officers, useful to anyone trying to rehabilitate the criminal, for example. So a very abstract theory could be absolutely correct, but the pragmatic philosopher, somebody like George Mead, would be much more interested in how to turn that abstract philosophy into something concrete, hands-on and usable, rather than having it all sort of armchair philosophizing. And that could include the definition of crime, how we define crime. So the definition of crime as anything that a government decides to outlaw is perfectly true, but is it terribly practical and beneficial to, say, a sociologist or a psychologist researching crime? Because it's such a broad swathe and it chops and changes every time the government chops and changes, that it covers too big an area. You might need a much more specific, more hands-on definition of crime in order to conduct useful research. So you might be looking at the definition of a very specific type of crime rather than some broad, nebulous definition of crime encompassing everything from double parking to cannibalism. Part of this definition of crime is thinking about what criminals do, what's going through their minds when they do it, and getting an insight into criminal ways of thinking, particularly where there is a sort of social construction aspect to the crime, either gang crime or crime that's very well understood and discussed and thought about in the mass media, so that anyone contemplating that crime will have been exposed to ideas and theories and beliefs about that type of crime prior to the point in time when they actually do it. Does getting inside the mind of the criminal help detect the crime? Does it help deter the crime? Does it help rehabilitate people who've committed the crime? And some of those questions may be answered with a yes, and some of them may be answered with a no, or a don't know. So again, it's trying to think about how we move from armchair sociology into pragmatic, hands-on applied sociology, applied criminology in this case, so that we're coming up with notions that are actually useful to either the detection, the deterrence, or the rehabilitation of crime. There are other angles that it could also be useful to, but those three particular angles are the ones most worth focusing on here. So the quote there from George Mead, "The individual mind can exist only in relation to other minds with shared meanings." That none of us are an island, we're not isolated little things. If we exist in a network of other people with whom we share at least some meanings. So a bit like a Venn diagram of overlapping circles, we overlap with other people, we derive our sense of self from other people. When we're very young, that is extremely pronounced, because we are deriving almost everything in our head from a parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle, big brother, big sister, whoever. As we get older, we start to exert more capacity for choice, who we want to pay attention to, who we're going to ignore, sources of information we will actively seek out that we might otherwise not know about, or not chance upon. We begin to exert capacity to think and choose, to pull away from some people and pull towards others. That's something that comes with age, by and large. But even there, what we're looking for is a sense of shared meaning. So if there is some politician you really admire, or a philosopher you strongly agree with, it's because you've got a sense of shared meaning with them. that what they say resonates with you. You can understand what they're saying, you can agree with it, you can want to hear more of it, and obviously that these days, many years after George Mead died, has an added resonance in the realm of social media, which increasingly, because of the way the algorithms on social media works, turns into an echo chamber, where we end up only hearing meanings that we already agree with and we already think. So it becomes a cycle of constant reinforcement with very little challenge, very little innovation, very little branching out in new directions. It's just hearing the same old, which is one of the reasons why in these lectures, for the various different modules you're on, we try to include quite different types of thinkers, some left-wing, some right-wing, some centrist, people all over the place. So there'll be some you agree with and some you strongly disagree with, but it's useful to hear from people you don't much like or have much common meaning with, because then at least you are experiencing new thoughts, and even if you still don't agree with them at the end of the day, you've at least considered them and reflected on why you don't agree with them, rather than just being stuck in a bubble of only hearing one opinion, one way, one possibility, one set of meanings. But we exist as if you like, a coagulation of all of the people we've ever encountered, both in the flesh and people we've only ever encountered on TV or in newspapers or in books or on social media or what have you. Both the people we like and the people we dislike. Why do we strongly reject ideas? Because of the people we've been exposed to espousing those ideas. Why do we strongly like and commit ourselves to other ideas and beliefs? Because we've had experience of those ideas and beliefs through other people. So we're a kind of a rolling stone gathering elements of other people as we roll through life. And the same is true for murderers and rapists and bank robbers and forgers and embezzlers and all the rest of it, as it is for the law-abiding, that they too have absorbed meanings and notions and ideas from the people they've encountered, which does include their criminal ideas and notions of meanings. Now, it could be said we all have criminal ideas, not in the Freudian sense he meant, that we all have the urge to do harm, but that we all have ideas about crime. Now, your ideas about crime may be that certain behaviours are very, very wrong and not simply illegal. You might feel that they are also deeply immoral, and that's why you would never do them. But there will be somebody else in the world who also has ideas about that type of crime, but their ideas enable them to go and do those behaviours, act in that way, because they presumably don't regard it as immoral. They will know it's illegal and they will be very conscious of getting caught, no doubt, but they don't have the same restraints that you have that stop you engaging in those behaviours that you strongly disapprove of. Where do those meanings come from? Well, we've touched on various case studies in the past where you can start to see elements of horrific childhood, perhaps conveying some very warped, damaged meanings into that person, who's then grown up and acted out some of those meanings. But equally, as with the vampire of Dusseldorf, when we were looking at him, and his, what was it, 9 brothers and sisters, I think it was, he was the only one known to have a criminal record, so they were all exposed to the violence and the sexual abuse and the horrible things that went on in that family when they were children, but he was the only one who carried it over into adulthood, the others didn't. So it's not a clear cut, I've been exposed to warped views and meanings, therefore I will be a warped person, because there are other people who have also been exposed to warped meanings and ideas who have stood strongly against them rather than embraced them. So this is not a clear-cut process of socialisation. It's much more complex than that. Now, going back to this means of living, it's not just, as I said, about making money in the usual sense of making a living. It's also about making meaning of ourselves, making meaning of other people, making meaning of objects and social institutions and what have you that we encounter in the world. So, to go with the examples we've got there, the artist looks at a blank canvas or a blank sheet of paper, and the meaning the artist gives to it is to start thinking about what they could be painting or drawing on that canvas. Somebody else who has no artistic bone in their body might look at the same canvas, the same blank sheet, and all they see is a blank sheet. They don't give it a second thought beyond that. It has no greater meaning or context to them than that. Or somebody else might look at a blank piece of paper and think about what they could write on it rather than what they could draw on it. So again, there's different levels of kind of what the object means to you is as much to do with you as it is to do with the object. So the meaning the object has, the blank page, isn't innate to the object, to the page, so much as it is inherent in the mind of the observer. So if, well, hopefully most of you were to look at a chest freezer, you might think about putting bags of chips or peas or something or another in it. A serial killer might think, oh, I could get 4 bodies in that, and think about it in a very different context. So yes, there is a degree to which the chest freezer has an innate functionality, and that functionality shapes to some extent how we think about it, but we also bring our own set of meanings to the object, which is, again, the meaning is more to do with us than it is to do with the actual object in and of itself. And that's not just true of canvases and chest freezers, it's true of how we relate to other people and then how we relate to ourselves. So we engage with other people, as we were saying earlier, partly in terms of the use they have for us. Which is a very unpleasant way of phrasing it, I appreciate. It's not meant to be quite as unpleasant as it sounds. Using other people, it sounds very exploitative. Maybe we could go for a nicer word like enhance. How can we utilise or enhance or gain from the people in our lives? So we might say, oh, I know Uncle Fred is good at putting up shelves, so if I need shelves putting up, I'll give Uncle Fred a ring because I know he's good at that. Doesn't mean you might not engage with Uncle Fred in other capacities as well, but you will be conscious that one of his uses, as it were, is that he's quite good at putting up shelves. And you might know that your friend Gladys is very sympathetic and has a good listening ear, so if you're ever in need of a weep and a wail, you'd turn to Gladys, but you probably wouldn't bother turning to Uncle Fred because you know he doesn't have patience for that kind of thing. So the uses that Fred has will be different uses from the uses that Gladys has. And so you start to understand people in certain contexts. But those contexts might be quite specific. Uncle Fred might be happy to put up shelves for you, but he wouldn't necessarily go and put up shelves for a random stranger in the street who asked him to. Gladys might be very, very sympathetic at listening to the miseries of her female friends, but she might not have the slightest patience at listening to the miseries of her male friends. So again, you would see perhaps Gladys as being a good listener, but one of her male friends might not see Gladys as being a good listener at all, because you're each approaching Gladys from a different angle, which is partly to do with Gladys's innate skills, but also to do with whether or not you want to make use of those skills and your understanding of how accessible, how worthwhile, how relevant to you those skills are. We then start thinking of ourselves in that context and how we exist in that context. So we become an object of use, to use George Mead's phrase. So there you are off at a job interview. You effectively, not only at the interview, but also when you're filling in the applications or writing the CV and all of that, you are treating yourself as an object of use. You're selling yourself. You're trying to convince your potential employer, this interviewer, that you are a thing worth having, that you can perform some function that will be of use to them. And so they are thinking of you as a potential object. Will this person be any good at this job? Will they have the skill set that we need? Will they have the personality, the attitude, the general mannerisms, along with the skill set that we need to get this job done? Are they reliable? Are they this? Are they that? Are they the other? They're thinking of you not in terms of how reliable are you as a friend, because they don't give a monkey's whether you're any reliable as a friend. They're only interested in how much use you are to them in the context, the social situation of employee, and vice versa. You might be the most fantastically speedy typist going, and much valued by your employer because of it, but your friends who never want anything typed for them neither know nor care that you're a speedy typist. They like you because you're funny, or because you make lots of cake or something or another, and that's the context they value you in, because they have no knowledge or interest in the kinds of contexts that your employer values you in. And it's not just employees that become objects of use. A politician saying, "Vote for me," is saying to you, "I will be of use to you once I'm in office, and here's 10 reasons why you should vote for me." And probably they'll only ever actually live up to one of them, but they're selling you on a bill of sale. They're selling themselves to you on a bill of sale that these are the ways in which I can be useful to you. When a religious missionary knocks on your door and gets you out the bath on a Sunday afternoon to go and talk to them, partly they are trying to sell you, in inverted commas, their religion on the basis that it is true, but they'll also talk to you, most likely, about the advantages of being a believer, that you'll get into heaven, that God will favour you in ways that he doesn't favour the unbeliever, this, that and the other. They might talk about, well, the church is only 5 minutes walk up the road, and we have a mothers and toddlers group, and we do OAP groups, and we do this and we do that. So again, it's saying that these are the ways in which subscribing to this religious doctrine rather than a political doctrine will bring you pragmatic advantages. So it's not simply the fact that I believe this is true, therefore you should believe this is true as well. It's also adding in a layer of usage, if you like, a sales pitch. Do we do that to some extent if we're out dating, trying to charm a potential boyfriend, girlfriend, to say, oh, well, I'm a really good cook, I'm amazing in bed, I'm this, I'm that, I'm the other, I'm all sorts of things, and you really, really want me. We're sort of selling ourselves in a sense, and expecting them to sell themselves to us as being desirable life partners, or at least desirable this evening as partners in some shape, form or capacity. Does the same go on at a criminal level? Well, a mugger isn't trying to sell themselves to the person they're mugging, but if we're looking at organised crime, mafia-style gangs, knife gangs, drug gangs, whatever else, somebody joining a gang is kind of going through what you could loosely call an interview process. That gang has to decide whether or not they want to take this new person on board, and part of what they'll be thinking about in taking this new person on board is how useful are they to the gang? Do they have any skills? That could be that they're really good at hot wiring cars, or they're really good at climbing up drain pipes to break into someone's house. Equally, their advantage, their usefulness, could be that they're a bit thick and they'll do as they're told and not ask too many questions. And so they'll be useful in that way, if not in more skillful-based ways. And vice versa. In order for somebody to want to join a criminal gang in the first place, they've got to have some thought, some sense that there will be advantages to them in being in the gang. So the gang is kind of advertising itself in the same way. Just as an employer will say, "Well, join us and we'll give you this wage packet and these holidays and these perks and this and this and this. And so we are worth applying for a job at." So the gang, in recruiting new members, will be saying, "Well, join us and you can make $2,000 a week selling cocaine, or smuggling people from one country to another country," or whatever the thing may be. They'll be pitching themselves as bringing some usage, some benefit to the people they want to incorporate as gang members. So whilst there are some crimes where it's difficult to see how this would apply to, there are other types of crime where it's more obvious how this applies to. So Mead argues that most relationships, possibly even all relationships, but certainly most relationships, involve give and take, exchange. a social exchange between one person and another. So whether it's parent-child, husband and wife, two friends, work colleagues, any other relationship you care to dream up, they're both getting something out of it. One of them might be getting an awful lot more than the other, and one of them might feel that whatever they're getting from it is something, frankly, they don't particularly want anyway. But there will be an exchange of some sort. Certainly in psychology there's all sorts of studies done on relationships and how people visualise whether a relationship is worthwhile or not in terms of the give and the take. Can we understand crime as, in terms of what makes a crime, less about this issue of it's a crime because the government says it is, and more to do with the intuitive notion that criminals are people who take but do not give back. So it's a one-way street. They are not engaging in social exchange. They're engaging in social extraction, profiteering, or whatever word you want to use. So if a mugger bashes me over the head with a brick and nicks my wallet, I have gained nothing from that brief, however, minute or so it took for the mugger to appear in my life. Can you even call that a relationship? Probably not. But that social interaction, let's put it like that. What have I gained? A fractured skull, some bruises, a sense of anxiety, nothing worth having. And the mugger has gained the contents of my wallet. So the social exchange has been violated. Is that what makes mugging a crime? Because it's taking without giving. There have been situations in history where taking without giving has been encouraged and permissible. So, for example, in Elizabethan England back in the 1500s, we had people like Walter Raleigh, who the Crown actively encouraged to go out and engage in piracy against Spanish ships and French ships and so on, robbing everything that was on the ship and taking it back, keeping some for themselves and giving the rest to the Crown. So they were taking and not giving anything back to the people on the Spanish ships that they were raiding. But there we have a slightly different context, because as a social exchange, it's permissible only if it's an individual group of people outside the community who are being fleeced. As long as you do the piracy on them foreign lot over there, not on your own people over here, then the forces of law and order in this country turn a blind eye to it, or indeed profit from it. So under certain circumstances, an act ceases to be seen as criminal because of who it is targeted at. And as long as it's outside the community, then this idea of social exchange within the community being violated is not an issue, doesn't become an issue. How do we understand the need for punishment and rehabilitation? Well, things like community service, like the guy in the picture with the orange jacket on, community payback, the idea that he, having committed whatever crime it was he committed, taken something out of the system, is now being made to put something back into the system, because he doesn't appear to be willing to put things back into the system unless a probation officer stands over him and breathes down the back of his neck and makes him do it. And therefore is this sort of teaching him that to be a member of the community you've got to put stuff back in. You can't just take all of the time. And it's obviously not just people on rather rough-looking council estates with shaven heads that take. There are many people driving around in Rolls Royces and Lamborghinis who take. But may not find themselves on the wrong side of a probation officer. That doesn't mean that they are necessarily held in high esteem by wider society if they are perceived as violating social exchange. That they just fleece people out of money on the stock exchange and give nothing back, for example. So a reflection that some crime at least might be understood as taking without giving. Now, whilst George Mead came up with the idea of labelling theory, and was one of the first people to advance it, others have picked up with it and run with it. Edwin Lemmet is an example, Becker is another example of someone who's run with labelling theory. Part of labelling theory, when it is applied to crime, is this idea that there are certain labels which, if they're put on you, are very difficult to get away from. And if the label is a negative label, it can really hamper your life. Sometimes you might say deservedly so, and other times you may feel as if it is undeservedly so. So, sticking with Lemmert's view, primary deviance is a minor label that is put upon someone. They've done something a little bit deviant, but not terribly serious, and as long as they stop doing the thing that's a little bit deviant, or it never moves beyond being little, then it's not considered a significant issue enough to stigmatise them in any major way. So that could be a little bit deviant in the sense of me talking to the pixies at the bottom of my garden, which is all a bit odd and weird, but wouldn't necessarily hamper my life in any greater way, even if people found out that I talked to the pixies at the bottom of my garden. It could be a 12-year-old who goes and steals a chocolate bar from a shop. Minor level deviance. Is it likely to haunt them for the next 40 years of their life? Probably not. It would seem terribly unreasonable to be labelling a 50-year-old as a thief because when they were 12 they nicked a chocolate bar once. I think most people would regard that as a rather unfair label to slap on a person's head. However, there are secondary deviances which start to impact not only how that person is understood socially by others, but also their self-concept, their self-understanding. Because secondary deviances are more serious levels of deviances that seem to shape the nature of a person in the eyes of society. And there's not always hard and fast guidelines laid out as to which things will be labelled as primary deviance and which things will be labelled as secondary deviance. This is where different cultures, different genders, social classes, races, religions, etc., come into play with having different views in different cultures and subcultures as to what's primary and what's secondary, or even indeed what is deviant in the first place. So different levels of understanding and attitude. In this society, for example, we might say, if you discovered that your next door neighbour was a crack dealer and had been dealing crack for the last 2 years, so it's not a one-off, it's a persistent pattern over 2 years, would that significantly change the way you view your next door neighbour? Would you view them as not simply deviant but criminal? I mean, obviously it is a criminal behaviour, but would you start to view them not just as a person who occasionally engages in criminal behaviour, but as someone who is hardcore criminal and engaging in quite a serious, quite a damaging behaviour? Would it change your willingness to ask them to babysit? Or if they said could they borrow 20 quid off you, would you be less willing to lend them 20 quid because you knew they were a crack dealer? You know, a crack dealer could make a ton of money and easily give you 20 quid back. So it may not be an issue to do with their capacity to pay back the money borrowed, but a general sense of maybe you're not wanting to get too involved with them morally, wanting to keep them at a distance. Some forms of secondary deviance, Lemmert says, are so serious that they shift into becoming what he terms master status. So they become the defining feature of that individual in the eyes of others, and quite possibly in the eyes of themselves as well. So we're moving into the realm of what is perceived as heavy-duty criminal behaviour, or heavy-duty deviant behaviour. Again, with this rider, that what one culture classes as heavy-duty deviant master status, another culture might not. So there is a degree of variance going on here. But these four as examples, which ones you would or would not class as master statuses, could be a topic of discussion, and we could, if you would like, create a live discussion using the chat facility on Brightspace. Let me know if you would like to do that, because we have to set it up for specific times, and then everyone has to log in at that specific time in order to engage in the chat facility. Or you might prefer just to sit and think about it and and ah at your own convenience. So, which of those would you think of as a master status? In other words, so defining a person that it totally changed the way you thought about them for the remainder of that individual's life. So if you discover that someone went out shoplifting every now and then, would you see them as a lifelong shoplifter? Is paedophilia something that can be done every now and then? In terms of frequency, there are obviously going to be some sex offenders who carry out more sex offences than others do. Some people might be once a year, others might be once a day. It's going to be very, very variable in the number of frequencies, but whether it's once a year or once a day, would you nonetheless understand it in a very different light, that this person is a paedophile for life? Whereas somebody else you might not necessarily think of as being a shoplifter for life, perhaps, although there may be some people you would think of in that light. And likewise, would it drastically change how you interact with that person once you know? So if you've gone from having you knew that person and had no idea about them, and then you suddenly at some juncture discover, does your behaviour towards them radically change once you discover their criminal sexual desires and activities? Likewise, let's say you find out that they torture dogs or cats or something for fun, and beforehand you had no idea they were doing that, but then you just discover, would that radically alter how you relate to them, or even if you relate to them at all? Would you then be avoiding them like the plague, for example? Would you see that as a lifelong characteristic, that once someone is engaged in that level of torture, they're always going to be flagged up as a possible serious concern? What if we put this in the same context as the earlier example of someone who shoplifted once when they were 12? So you find out that this 30-year-old who you've now met, when they were 11, tortured a cat. You've got no reason to suppose they've done any cat torturing since then, but you find out they did it when they were 11. Would that radically alter how you understand that person, what you think about that person, how willing you are to trust that person in different capacities? And this would raise a question of what those capacities would be. So presumably you wouldn't be trusting the next door neighbour if you knew they were a paedophile. You wouldn't be trusting them to babysit, or if you knew they tortured a cat once, you might not want to ask them to look after your cat while you're on holiday. But if you ran a factory, would you trust them to have a job pushing a broom around the factory as a cleaner? Would that be related to that aspect of what we've just found out about their behaviour, their character? Or would you say, no, well, that's, pushing a broom around a factory is neither here nor there, therefore they can be trusted to do that, even if they would not be trusted in other capacities? So again, to what extent is that master status far-reaching? How much of that person's life does it permeate? If you see that as the dominant characteristic of their life, how likely are they to see that as the dominant characteristic of their own life as well? So your outside point of view of them versus their internal view of themselves, and the overlap of that person. Does their behaviour in one context alter, change how you understand all of their other behaviours? Fairly obvious example, rather unpleasant example here, might be somebody like, let's say, Jimmy Savile, who, even though I always thought he was a little bit creepy personally, but before I knew anything about what he was getting up to in a criminal context, obviously he raised millions for charity over the years. Do we now view his charitable fundraising in the light of his criminal master status? So do we see that as a genuine act? He really genuinely did, hand on heart, want to raise money for charity and buy ventilators or whatever it was for Stoke Mandeville Hospital and all that kind of thing? Or do we now suspect that this was just a front, a cover, so he could get away with other horrible behaviours and hide behind the mask, and therefore he wasn't doing that fundraising out of any sort of genuine goodwill, it was all just a put up front? How do we understand that in that context? You could think about some of these things in terms of social exchange, those who take but give nothing back except for damage. Is that part and parcel of what makes the behaviour deviant, or is it way more and beyond that that is the key critical deviance and issue there? If we were looking at examples historically or cross-culturally, we might be able to find examples of behaviour that once upon a time would have been considered master statuses, but these days might be considered secondary or primary forms of deviance. Likewise, we might find things that 100, 200, 300 years ago might have been considered very minor, which nowadays would be considered very major. So an example of that, if we went back 400 years and met Joe Bloggs and was told that Joe Bloggs owned 2 slaves, 400 years ago that would not have been considered a major issue in society, any more than someone owning a washing machine and a tumble dryer in this day and age would be considered a major issue. However, in this day and age, if you discovered that the woman living down the road has 2 people enslaved and living in her cellar, that I'm pretty sure would become a master status, a huge criminal furore, and totally change the way you understood that woman. So things go in and out over the period of history and different cultures as to what's master, what's primary, what's secondary. So you can have a think about these and discuss them, again, whether through chat or just sit, have a cup of coffee and mull over it, whatever you prefer. Which of these would you say should be criminalised? Which should not? Which of these are maybe not deviant at all, or are only primary deviant, minor issues, and which would migrate towards being secondary issues, more serious, more worrying issues? Are there any on that list that you would put in the master category as really defining that individual very, very strongly? You're going to have presumably different opinions on this. Some of you might think certain things are serious and others of you might think it's not serious at all. But what does it say about your understanding of the person engaging in those behaviours? Which brings us, after a bit of a breath, to the next case study, which I said earlier was Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper is an American murderer. He's still alive, well at least he is at this moment of recording. By the time you're listening to it, he might not be alive for all I know, but he is at the moment. Now an elderly man. He was nicknamed by the newspapers the Co-Ed Killer because he went around murdering a number of students from a local campus nearby where he lived. Convicted of 10 murders altogether, not all of them were students, that includes other people. Stood trial in 1973. He's been in prison ever since. He has had the possibility for parole, but he absolutely refuses to attend those meetings. Therefore, he cannot gain parole if he doesn't attend the parole meetings in America. The reason he doesn't attend parole, he says himself, and let's assume he's being honest here, he says he likes living in prison. He doesn't like living outside of prison. He finds life on the outside deeply unpleasant, and he kind of knows where he is. He has a place in the prison society, a status, a routine, a sense of regularity. He was comfortable with it, and he's willing to stay there until the day he finally dies. Never wants to go out. Now, I won't play the interview clip there in the course of this narrated presentation because I think it will probably crash the entire presentation. But you can go on to the uploaded PowerPoint in the PowerPoint section of Brightspace and click on the link and play it yourself. It's just an interview with him talking to an interviewer for a while. There are also, you'll find other links come up associated with it for documentaries around Kemper, going into the details of his crime in more depth than we will do in the duration of this PowerPoint. So in terms of what those crimes are, going back to 1964, he had had a very troubled early life. His parents eventually split up, and he lived for a little while with his father, but that didn't pan out, and then he went to live with his mother, and that really didn't pan out because he and his mother seemed to have hated the sight of each other. very caustic sort of a relationship. And eventually he was packed off to live with his grandparents on their farm. Difficult to establish quite what he felt about his grandparents because he hadn't been there very long when he shot his grandmother dead. He was only 15 years old at the time. And when asked about it afterwards by the police, he said he just wanted to see what it would feel like to shoot someone. So he didn't say he hated his grandmother or he'd been arguing with her or she'd found him doing something and he'd shot her. Just that he was curious, which is a very odd motive for committing a crime. He then saw his grandfather, who's also had the same first name of Edmund, walking back up the lane, coming back to the house, and he didn't want his grandfather to see his wife dead, to see Maud dead. Didn't want his grandfather to be upset, which suggests that he perhaps liked his grandfather somewhat more than his grandmother. And so he shot the grandfather as well to prevent him having the shock of seeing his own wife dead on the floor. And then pretty much gave himself up and was confined to a psychiatric institution for a number of years, where he, again, much like at the moment, he was regarded as a model inmate, very well behaved, did everything asked of him, never caused trouble, etc. And eventually he was declared sane enough to be let out. We'll come back to that in a minute. But having been let out, went back to live with his mother and stayed there a while. His known crimes, the ones he's confessed to, and at the moment there's no real suggestion that there could be any additional unknown crimes for Kemper the way there are for some of the other case studies that we've looked at so far, where it's speculated that some of them at least may have killed way more people than they were ever charged with. These are the known and presumed only crimes that he committed afterwards. So these ones were all students at the local college: Marianne Pesci, Anna Lucchesa, Aka Koo, Cindy Shaw, Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu. Some of them he picked up as hitchhikers, murdered them usually by strangling, and sexually assaulted them, but just to put you off your lunch, so you might want to turn this off if you're about to eat anything and listen to it later. Most of these sexual assaults he carried out were post-mortem. That is to say, he did things with the dead bodies rather than with them when they were still alive. And there is certainly evidence to suggest that he would cut off usually the heads of the bodies, dispose of the body and keep the head for quite some time, and just the sanitary issues don't really bear thinking about, in order to talk to the head and do things with the head, let's put it like that. I'll leave you to listen to the documentaries and find out the details for yourself if you don't already know them as to quite what he was doing. It really is quite disgusting and unpleasant, so you might prefer not to know in the first place. His final two crimes were to murder his own mother, Clarnell. He then engaged in some profoundly Freudian behaviour, which had Freud still been alive in 1973, he would have written chapter and verse about, I do not doubt. He took a knife and sliced out his mother's throat, cut out her vocal cords, and stuffed them down the kitchen sink where they had the waste disposal unit, where there's things that grinds up things that you put down the sink. So he ground up her vocal cords in the waste disposal unit of the kitchen sink, which is a very obvious way of silencing her. Apparently she was at something of a nag, and so this was a very overt reference to that. He also did things with his mother's body that don't bear thinking about in any greater detail than that. And having disposed of his mother, he got on the phone to the mother's best friend, Mrs. Hallett, and said, "Oh, Mum has invited you over, will you come over for a cup of coffee?" Or words to that effect. And Mrs. Hallett came over, and she'd barely been in the door a minute or two when he murdered her as well, and again engaged in unsanitary things with the body. Jumped in a car and drove off. And got a few miles away, and then pulled the car over when he saw a telephone box, phoned up the police and handed himself in, reported himself to the police for the murder of his mother and the best friend. They weren't convinced. They thought he was mentally unhinged and was just hallucinating the whole thing and was an attention seeker. But they did the correct thing. They went round to the house to double check on what had been said and were horrified to discover 2 corpses, that he wasn't delusional, he really had done this. And then very rapidly after that he confessed to the other murders as well. The reason for handing himself in, he said, and again we've flagged this up as an issue in previous lectures, that when we're taking on board confessions of convicted killers, you sometimes have to have a bit of a pinch of salt to whether or not you believe the motivations they say. They could be saying them for other reasons than sheer honesty. He said he fully expected to be caught by that point in time and taken away back to confinement. He had already experienced that period of confinement as a teenager, wanting to go back to it. And the fact that nobody had caught him, he found surprising and, well, I suppose disappointing in some ways. And so, rather than just hanging around waiting to be caught, he handed himself in. That's the man himself. He's remarkably tall, well over 6 foot, about 6'6", 6'7", something like that, and has a phenomenally high IQ, which is in direct distinction to some of the people we've looked at. The vampire Dusseldorf we touched on the other week, who had a very low IQ, was practically subnormal. The majority of killers do not have high IQs, so that sort of cinematic image of Hannibal Lecter, the super clever psychiatrist, in the whole series of books and films about him, Hannibal the Cannibal books, that's a bit of an anomaly. The vast majority of killers in real life are not that clever, which is something you might want to think about if you're doing that last piece, when you get around to doing that last piece of coursework, where you're comparing fictional versions of crime to the real thing. You could go for a film, TV show involving some super clever criminal genius, and comparing that to the reality. But this guy, Kemper, is one of the few examples of someone who's committed horrific crimes who really did have a high IQ. Which goes to show that intelligence, or lack of intelligence, may not be the critical issue here in terms of self-control and impulse control in the story. Now, he's the only son, he had sisters, but the only son of Clarnell and Edmund, which, grandfather, father, son. Edmund is a family name passed down the generations. The husband and wife, already mentioned, the parents, Clarnell and Edmund, split up, couldn't cope with each other anymore. And when the father was interviewed later on, after all this came to light, discovered what his son had been getting up to, journalists and police officers and what have you went to interview him and see, did you have any suspicions, blah blah blah. He said that living with his wife Clarnell back in the day when they were married, he said that suicide missions in wartime and the atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with her. Said she had the vilest temper, screaming, shouting, ranting, raving, throwing things, saying the vilest, most horrible kind of abuse to him, to the son, to all neighbours and all manner of other people. She was just this very, very poisonous person, quite horrendously so. They split up in 1957. They were apart for quite some time. Well, apart permanently really, but in some level of contact by phone and what have you with each other. Eventually. Ed and the daughters remained living with the mother, as was fairly common back in the 50s, so that's the situation. Oh, it still is, for that matter. However, the mother, Clarnell, whilst her daughters slept in beds in their bedrooms, they insisted that Edward, who was still young at this stage, had to sleep in the cellar with the door locked to prevent him getting out of the cellar until she herself would open it up the next morning, because she was worried that her son would go and rape his own sisters. Now, why she was worried that, no one is entirely sure, because obviously by the time all of this came to public light, she was dead and couldn't be interviewed about the issue. And the father wasn't there at the time in the house to know what her motivations and her rationale of thinking were. Now, is it that he had done something which quite sensibly led the mother to see him as a sexual threat to their daughters? Or was the mother simply mentally deranged and imagining that he was a threat when in actuality he wasn't at all at that stage in his life? But did her constant heaping on him of accusations and imprecations and suggestions warp him to such an extent after years and years and years of earache from her that he turned into the very thing that she believed he already was anyway? Kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of a sort going on there, which goes in with the theories of people who've looked at in the past, like Bonga, that sometimes if you predict a certain thing is going to happen, the very act of predicting makes it happen, brings it into play. She said her son was a real weirdo. Well, we certainly know he was as an adult, and he was pretty damn weird at the age of 15 when he was shooting his grandparents. But was he a real weirdo earlier? Or was it abuse by his mother and estrangement from his father and maybe other factors that turned him slowly, little by little, into the weird adult he became? We just don't know, and it becomes speculation on this grounds. Parallels can be drawn between Clarnell and Augusta Gein, who was the mother of Ed Gein, Mother Ed. Ed Gein lived with his mother almost the entirety of his adult life. Father had died. There was a brother. Ed Gein had a brother who also lived on the family farm, and the brother died in a fire of somewhat dubious circumstances. It was put down as an accident, but people have since speculated might not have been. ... Augusta Gein was hugely religious in a very disturbed and unhinged sort of a way, not a nice way. If any of you have ever either read the book Carrie or seen the film, Carrie's mother, this sort of ranting, screaming character who terrorises and abuses her daughter, is at least partially based on the idea of Augusta Gein and her relationship with her son. She essentially told her son that all women were dirty, filthy trollops, no better than they should be, and the only pure woman in the world was herself. All the others were wicked and should never have anything to do with women, and as far as anyone can tell, he never had a ordinary romance or sexual relationship with a woman, at least not a living woman. Because Ed Gein was in the habit of going down the local graveyard once his mother had died and he went completely strange, going down the local graveyard and digging up fresh bodies of middle-aged women, i.e. the same age group as his mother, and taking the bodies home with him, where he did all sorts of things of varying levels of unsanitary nature, and eventually would make furniture out of their bones and their skin, and had bits of them in jars in the fridge, and just a nightmare household. But again, he had this very, very warped relationship with his mother, which also partly inspired Robert Bloch to write the short story on which the film Psycho was based, about Norman Bates, with the famous shower scene in Hitchcock's film version of the book, with his deranged mother, who plagues him even years after she's died because he hears the voice of his mother in his mind. So the parent-child relationship can be horrendously damaging. And it raises this question, like going back to George Mead and the idea of overlapping patterns of meaning between people. To what extent does a child gain their meaning and understanding of the world and of social relationships and of objects and people within the world from interactions with their parents? And this isn't to say that Clarnell was 100% to blame, because there's a father there and various other adults in Kemper's life as he was growing up, the grandparents, etc. So there may be a whole number of people who helped to turn a presumably fairly ordinary child into a very warped, damaged adult and acquire very disturbed patterns of meaning from the adults around him. To what extent do we include the mother in this as a significant factor? Bearing in mind she's dead and can't be interrogated about it anymore. Some people might leap to Clarnell's defence and say, well, you can't blame the mother for the criminality of the son. If he went round raping and murdering these various college girls and shooting his grandparents and what have you, then that is his choice. He should take the blame for that. And no matter how horrible his mother was or inadequate his father was, etc., that you can't blame them, particularly the mother, because she was murdered by him and the father was not murdered by him. So she is one of his victims. And in effect, what we're kind of saying is when he was a child, was he her victim of her instability and abusiveness? And as he grew older, she eventually became his victim, a kind of a role reversal. But is it ever fair to say, well, this person would only have committed these horrific crimes because that person, pointing the finger at somebody, parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle, whoever it is, that they have gone on to kill themselves, that person damaged them to the extent where it turned them into the kind of monster they became? There's a point of open debate there. And it would be interesting to hear your views on this one. Yardley looked at a whole series of case studies and crime patterns, comparing the behaviour and influence of mothers of various criminal sons and criminal daughters, which is often a lot of films, they focus on the mother-son relationship. For these sort of horror graphic films, they don't often mention mother-daughter or father-son, father-daughter patterns of relationship. So Yardley was trying to broaden this out to sons and daughters. And she highlighted this fact that a lot of psychologists, perhaps tracking all the way back to Freud and his views on motherhood, tend to focus on the ideas of mothers as damaging forces in their children's lives, more so than the idea of fathers as damaging forces in their children's lives. Is that, and Yardley just kind of leaves this as a speculation, so you'll have hopefully your own views on this, is that just plain bog standard sexism on the part of researchers, maybe stemming all the way back to Freud's argument, as I say, or is this simply realism, that mothers, either for good or for ill, tend to have more impact on their children than fathers do, tend to spend more time with them, for example? Certainly if we're going back a few decades when there were more stay-at-home mothers and fewer working mothers than there are in this day and age. So in terms of ratio of hours, certainly if we're going back to the 60s and 70s, mothers did spend more time with their kids than most fathers did. Is that still the case? So if you've got a 10-year-old these days and they grow up to be a criminal in 10, 15, 20 years' time, will the psychologists and the sociologists of that point in the future be blaming it on the mothers, blaming it on the fathers, blaming it on both, or looking in an entirely different direction? As society changes, does our understanding of patterns of harm and family dynamics also change? Question to ask. We'll get more onto labelling theory and Becker's take on labelling theory next week, and this idea that once you're labelled in a certain way, especially a very negative, deviant way, there are certain labels like the proposal around master status, certain labels that are very hard to get away from, even if they are completely unfair. Nonetheless, they become problematic. And be... I say next week, I should point out, of course, next week as such will be after the Easter holidays. Next class, rather than next week, that I should say. Because we've got the 3-week Easter holidays before we get on to Becker and labelling theory in more depth. And it's after the Easter holidays that you hand in your teaching materials. So forget next week, think next class. Deep breath. Now, at this juncture, obviously, neither I nor you nor anyone else has any clue as to what's going to happen over the next 3 weeks of the Easter holidays. It's possible, let's keep our fingers crossed, that some marvellous cure or vaccine or something or another might be discovered and life starts to return to normal, in which case we might possibly be back in class face to face, which would be lovely. Or it may be that the 3-week lockdown is extended a bit further, or even if it's not, that nonetheless the college decides out of safety issues and health issues that it's better to continue with these distance forms of learning with narrated PowerPoints and what have you, in which case the one on Becker will be narrated the same way this is, rather than a face-to-face one. So we'll have to play it by ear. But let's try to make more usage of contacting each other via things like the class facility, chat facility I should say, or Facebook or something or another, so we can engage with each other and it's not just sort of you listening to a disembodied voice and having no greater contact than that. We'll build up on that as we go along. But that's the end for now. I'm going to go and drink an awful lot of tea because my throat is starting to feel like sandpaper, and hope you're well. See you hopefully soon. Bye bye.